She's known as the Long Island medium. Theresa Caputo has been giving psychic readings to people across the country for years.
Caputo wrote, "I personally know a lot about fear and how it can roll into full-blown panic and inertia because it dominated a good chunk of my life for 25 years.
Imagine losing someone you loved. Not just the funeral, not the flowers, not the quiet condolences, but the silence afterward. When the world moves on and you're left alone, wondering if they can still hear you. For millions, Theresa Caputo claims she can. Not just hear them, but speak to them. To some, she's a miracle, a bridge between this world and the next. To others, she's a master of performance.
Theresa Caputo, she's dubbed the Long Island medium, says she speaks to spirits, conveys their messages to loved ones still.
Reading people with uncanny precision. But what if none of that matters? What if the real story isn't about proof, but about the way it makes us feel, the way it forces us to confront grief, hope, and the possibility of connection beyond life itself? This isn't just a TV show. This isn't just entertainment. This is a cultural phenomenon. And the questions it raises are far bigger than one person. The Theresa Caputo, real or fake? Theresa Caputo was born in 1966 in Hicksville, New York, a name that sounds almost too on the nose for a woman whose story would one day divide the country. She grew up in a loud, loving, deeply Catholic Italian-American household, the kind where Sunday dinners lasted 3 hours, and everybody had something to say at once. By her own account, she was never the quiet kid in the corner. She was animated, warm, almost magnetically social. The kind of person who made you feel like the most important person in the room the moment she turned her attention toward you. That quality would later become central to everything. But she also had something that, as a child, she didn't quite have the language for. Theresa has described growing up with an almost constant sense of anxiety, a buzzing, restless energy that followed her everywhere. As a teenager and young adult, she saw therapist after therapist trying to understand it. Nothing seemed to help. That is, until she started working with a spiritual healer, a man named Pat Longo, who told her that what she'd been feeling her entire life wasn't anxiety at all. It was spirit, trying to come through. Whether you believe that or not, something shifted for Theresa after that point. The anxiety, or whatever it was, began to lift. She started giving what she called readings to people in her local community. Word spread quietly, the way it does in tight-knit neighborhoods. A friend of a friend, a cousin who'd lost someone, a mother who needed to know if her son was okay. She built her early reputation the old-fashioned way, one person at a time, kitchen table to kitchen table. On Long Island, she wasn't charging thousands of dollars or booking stadium tours. She was just Theresa from Hicksville, sitting across from someone who was hurting and saying things that sometimes left them shaking. And then, in 2011, TLC came calling. Long Island Medium debuted that September and became something of a cultural earthquake in the niche world of paranormal television. But here's what separated it from every other ghost whisperer show that had come before it.
The experience isn't about believing in mediums. It's about witnessing something life-changing.
It didn't lean into the darkness. There were no candlelit seances, no theatrical fog machines, no trembling violins on the soundtrack. Theresa Caputo was relentlessly, defiantly normal. She drove an SUV. She bickered with her husband Larry about leaving cabinet doors open. She complained about traffic on the Long Island Expressway like every other person who's ever had the misfortune of sitting on the LIE at 5 p.m. on a Friday. And then she'd walk into a room full of strangers and reduce someone to tears inside of 90 seconds. That contrast, the ordinary life interrupted by the extraordinary claim, is exactly what made people tune in by the millions. The show ran for 14 seasons. 14. That's not a television program. That's an institution. She wrote books. She launched live touring shows that filled arenas from New Jersey to Nevada. She appeared on every talk show you can name. She wasn't just a medium anymore. She was a brand, a movement, and for many grieving Americans, something approaching a lifeline. The question was always going to come. It always does. When someone builds something this big on a foundation, this unverifiable, the question was, is any of this real? The skeptics strike back. Let's talk about cold reading for a second. Not because it's proof of anything, but because you deserve to understand the tool that critics say is at the center of everything. Cold reading is a set of techniques, developed, refined, and documented over decades, that allows a skilled practitioner to seem to know things about a person they've never met. It sounds like magic. It isn't. It's psychology. The basic mechanics go something like this. You make a high-probability statement, something statistically likely to be true for a large portion of your audience. I'm getting a male energy, older, a father figure, or perhaps an uncle. In a room of grieving people, the odds that someone has lost a father, grandfather, or uncle are extraordinarily high. When someone responds, you follow their energy, watch their body language, listen to their words, use their own reactions to guide you toward specificity. There's also what researchers call the Barnum effect, named after P.T. Barnum's quote that there's something for everyone in his circus. Statements like, I sense there was something left unsaid between you, or they want you to know they weren't in pain, are broad enough to feel personal to almost anyone who's lost someone. They're not lies, exactly. They're just wide nets. And then there's hot reading. This is more deliberate. Gathering information about someone before a reading through social media profiles, obituaries, public records, or pre-show questionnaires filled out by audience members. Critics of live medium shows have pointed to this practice for years, arguing that the era of Facebook and Instagram has made it almost trivially easy to walk into a room knowing more than you should. James Randi, the legendary skeptic and magician who spent decades debunking paranormal claims.
Over in the US, James Randi was a professional magician who, like many magicians, had an interest in debunking the claims of psychics and spirit mediums.
Was one of the most persistent critics of mediumship as a practice. His foundation offered a $1 million prize to anyone who could demonstrate genuine paranormal ability under controlled scientific conditions. Nobody ever collected it. Randi argued that mediums, however charming, were essentially performing a psychological trick on people at their most emotionally vulnerable, and that the real damage wasn't financial, but emotional. Chris Angel, the illusionist, went further. In public statements, he called out Theresa Caputo specifically, challenging her to demonstrate her abilities under conditions where cold reading would be impossible. She didn't take him up on it. And then there was the Inside Edition investigation. In 2012, the television news magazine ran a segment that had undercover cameras at one of Theresa's live shows. What the footage suggested, and what the producers argued it showed, was the classic pattern of cold reading in action. Broad opening statements, calibration based on audience response, the gradual narrowing toward specifics that felt, to the recipient, like miraculous knowledge. Theresa and her team disputed the framing. Her supporters called it a hit piece. Her critics called it confirmation. The truth, as usual, depended almost entirely on what you were already inclined to believe. Here's what's interesting, though, and this is where the story gets genuinely complicated. When researchers actually study mediumship, the results are rarely simple. Some studies, including work done at the University of Arizona, have suggested that certain mediums produce information that can't be easily explained by cold reading alone. These studies have methodological critics of their own, and mainstream science remains firmly skeptical. But the conversation isn't as closed as the loudest voices on either side would have you believe. What we know for certain is this: Theresa Caputo has never submitted herself to a rigorous, double-blind scientific test of her abilities. She has said, in various interviews, that spirit doesn't work that way, that the energy of skepticism interferes with the connection. Her critics say that's a convenient answer. Her supporters say it makes perfect sense. Both of them are absolutely certain they're right. The human cost behind the gift. We've spent a lot of time talking about what Theresa Caputo might or might not be doing. Let's talk about what she's actually living. Because whatever you believe about the source of her abilities, spirit or psychology or something in between, the work itself is undeniably heavy. Think about it this way. Every single day, Theresa Caputo walks into rooms full of people who are devastated. People who have lost children, spouses, parents who died in accidents, kids who overdosed, soldiers who didn't come home. She doesn't get to pick and choose the easy losses. She sits with all of it. She holds all of it. And then she has to go home. She has described something she calls bond energy, a physical sensation that she claims she experiences when spirit is present or communicating. She's said she can feel chest pressure when someone died of a heart attack, or a tightening in her throat when someone passed from something respiratory. Whether this is supernatural empathy or an extraordinarily developed form of somatic anxiety is, again, a matter of interpretation. But the fatigue it produces is real. She's talked about that openly. There were years, she said in interviews, where she would come home from a taping or a live event so emotionally and physically drained that she could barely form sentences. She would sit in her car, in her own driveway, unable to go inside. And not because she didn't want to be home, but because she didn't know how to switch it off. And then there's Larry. Larry Caputo, her husband of nearly 30 years, was as central to Long Island Medium as Theresa herself. Their bickering, their affection, their completely ordinary marriage playing out alongside something completely extraordinary. It was the heart of the show. Audiences loved them together. They seemed, in the most genuine way, like people who had simply built a life and happened to have a very unusual job description. In 2017, they announced their separation. The divorce was finalized in 2018. Theresa has spoken carefully about what happened. She's talked about growing apart, about the show changing their lives in ways neither of them fully anticipated. It's about the toll of constant public scrutiny on a private relationship. Larry has been equally measured. Neither of them turned it into a tabloid story, but it was impossible not to notice. Here was a woman who claimed to help others process loss, now processing her own. Fame does this. It doesn't discriminate. It takes the person you were before anyone was watching and slowly, persistently separates you from them. Theresa Caputo became a character, larger than life, bigger hair than God, perpetually moved to tears by invisible presences, and somewhere in the gap between that character and the real woman who drove carpool and worried about her kids' homework, something got lost. She is, in the end, a human being who built something enormous and had to learn to carry the weight of it. That's a story worth treating with some tenderness, regardless of what you think about the work itself. Why people still believe. Let me introduce you to a concept that psychologists call continuing bonds theory. For a long time, Grief counseling operated on what you might call the moving on model. The idea that healthy grieving meant eventually detaching from the person you'd lost, accepting their absence, and rebuilding your identity without them. This was the dominant view for most of the 20th century. And then, in the 1990s, researchers began challenging it. Studies showed that many people who were doing perfectly well after loss, functioning, connected to others, leading meaningful lives, had never actually let go of their bond with the deceased. They still talked to them. They still felt their presence. They still sought, in various ways, to maintain a relationship. And what Theresa Caputo offers, whatever the mechanism, is permission. Permission to not be done. Permission to still have a relationship with someone who is no longer physically present. Permission to hear, one more time, that they knew they were loved, that they forgive you, that the last thing you said to each other wasn't the last word. Is that worth something? Even if the words are coming from Theresa's own intuition, or her reading of the room, or her genuinely extraordinary ability to perceive emotional distress, is the outcome still meaningful? A 2014 study published in the journal Omega found that individuals who had received a mediumship reading reported significant reductions in grief intensity and increases in their sense of continued connection with the deceased. The researchers were careful to note that they weren't studying whether mediumship was real, they were studying whether it helped. And for many of the participants, it did. That's a complicated finding to sit with, because it suggests that the comfort delivered in a medium's reading may be genuinely therapeutic, regardless of its source. Her loyal fan base, and it remains vast, a decade and a half into her public career, will tell you that they don't particularly care what the skeptics say, because they were there. They felt something. They walked out of that theater carrying something they hadn't walked in with. And nobody, they'll argue, has the right to take that from them. The critics, of course, have a counter to all of this. They'll say that comfort built on a false premise is not comfort. It's exploitation. And that people in grief are not equipped to critically evaluate what's happening to them. That a skilled cold reader is doing something morally different from a skilled grief counselor, even if the emotional outcome looks similar. And that counter deserves to be heard, too. This is the place where Theresa Caputo lives, caught between two groups of people who are equally certain about something that cannot be proven or disproven by any instrument currently available to us. She has never, in all these years, fully crumbled under the weight of the skepticism. She's also never submitted herself to the kind of controlled testing that might settle the question. She exists deliberately in the space between proof and faith, which, if you think about it, is exactly where her audience lives too. As the lights come up and the crowd begins to disperse, one question remains suspended in the air, unanswered but undeniable. What if the need for connection, for closure, is more powerful than the need for truth itself? For over a decade, Theresa Caputo has stood at the crossroads of skepticism and faith, offering healing through the very uncertainty that others might shy away from. Whether it's a bridge to the afterlife or an incredible act of empathy and skill, the emotions in that room, the tears, the laughter, the shared moments of release, are undeniably real. But the question persists. Is it the moment that heals, or is it the belief that it can? Does it matter whether the message is truly coming from the other side, or is it enough that people walk away feeling something greater than they did before they entered? Theresa Caputo has carried the weight of strangers' grief, standing under the intense scrutiny of millions who doubt, while being fiercely needed by those who believe. Her ability to show up week after week, city after city, in the face of so much uncertainty speaks to something deeper than just performance. But what does that something really mean? And so, as we close tonight, I leave you with this. In your own moments of loss, what would you reach for? The answer, or the hope, the truth, or the peace it brings? This is not just a conversation about spirit or skepticism. This is a conversation about what it means to need to believe and what it costs to carry that belief. And as we sit with these questions, one thing is certain: the deeper we go, the more complicated it gets. The story doesn't end here. It's just beginning.